Hello and welcome to a beginner's guide to Werewolf the Apocalypse. Before we begin, I'm going to say that, once again, you should always look at the revised edition over the first edition, because the revised edition is much better and less racist. I hate that I have to say, hey, watch out for the racism of first edition, but first edition was what all the edgelords released, mostly without being edited too much. And when you're dealing with Werewolf, which covers a lot of different ethnic groups, and in some cases, things like Native Americans, you're going to want to look at the revised edition. Also, I guess trigger warning, I suppose, that racism might come up a lot in this video, because more so than age, things like ethnic cleansing, genocide, and racial superiority come into play when we're talking about Werewolf, because these are plot points in Werewolf. So I'm going to give you a warning now before you get into it. We're going to have to talk about those things, because they're worth talking about when we're talking about like a beginner's introduction to Werewolf. You should not go in without realizing that these sorts of topics are going to come up. So, Werewolf is easier than Mage, harder than Vampire to get into for new players. Okay? Werewolf is more direct and concrete than Mage is, but it's a lot more complex in terms of, like, structure than Vampire is. And we'll get into why that is in a little bit. But first we need to talk a little bit about the lore and kind of, like, extrapolate from there. Because more so than Vampire even, the lore is overwhelming in Werewolf. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, but it'll probably become obvious what I mean as you hear it. So the main conflict in Werewolf is between werewolves themselves and the worm. Essentially, in the beginning of time, there are three forces that make up Gaia, essentially the Earth. They are the worm, which is in charge of, like, destroying things. There's the Weaver, which puts things, like, together. And then there's the Wild, which is everything at its natural state. And in the very distant past, everything was at peace, and the three forces kind of worked together. The Wild kind of existed, and then the Weaver would build things, and then the Worm would destroy it, and then the stuff that was destroyed would become the Wild again. And it became a cycle, and everything was happy, and it worked. And then one day, the Weaver decided, for some reason, that it was tired of the Worm destroying things, and so it wrapped the Worm up in a cocoon, and the cocoon was so tight that the Worm couldn't get out of it, and the Worm went insane. And it decided that it was just going to destroy everything. And that's where everything goes wrong. Because, you see, the Worm just starts destroying everything, including the Wild, including everything the Weaver has been building, and essentially now there's conflict. Because the Worm has been corrupted and gone mad, and for some reason the Weaver is never punished for this, as far as I know. And so this introduces the need for werewolves, who are protectors of Mother Earth, and they want to stop all the evil of the Worm, because the Worm is corrupt and evil and creates Fomori, who are essentially monsters. They are corrupted evil things, and they destroy the world. If this sounds very Captain Planet, it's because it is. And there's a lot of, like, environmentalist, us versus the evil corporations, because the Fomori are overwhelmingly created by evil corporations, by Pentex, which is an evil capitalist evil capitalist corporation that apparently does nothing except produce toxic chemicals. And if you want to roast basic werewolf game you can possibly run, having a bunch of environmentalist werewolves who are fighting back against big capitalism is the way to go. However, some people might immediately go, well, wait a minute. That sounds all very modern. And werewolves have ostensibly existed since, like, the dawn of time, right? Because we're talking about, like, you know, Gaia and the Weaver and the Worm. And whenever you talk about concepts like that, you're referring to a time pre-human civilization, basically. Nobody ever goes, and that was when the wild existed, and talks about modern day. You're always talking about the past. And that's true, because you see, depending on who you ask among werewolves either exist to protect Gaia, or they exist to enforce a kind of racial hierarchy upon the universe, depending on who you're talking to. Because you see, werewolves are of different opinions about humanity, because a lot of them are like, humanity is a tool of the worm, and our job originally was to scare humanity and kill them whenever they became too numerous. And at some point we gave up on that job of killing humanity when they became too numerous. And now look at the world. So we need to go back to the whole kill every human, because there's way too many of them. If that sounds like genocide, it is. And they are open about this. There are others who are like, actually, humanity can help us fight the worm, and we should partner with them. And given a lot of us are changed from humans, we probably don't want to commit, mass genocide against, humanity, because those are pretty much all relatives. To point out that there's a weird kind of eugenics thing that underpins a lot of werewolf, which is kind of uncomfortable. So, there's only 3 kinds of werewolves in the world. You're either born of a wolf, that means 2 wolves mate, and the child can become a werewolf. 2 humans mate, and the child becomes a werewolf. Usually a werewolf and a human, or a werewolf and a wolf. Or 2 werewolves mate, and you get an abomination. And that thing must be killed immediately. And so there are entire tribes of werewolves who are very into purity of blood. For example, the Red Talons, who are wolf supremacists who believe that humans are a mistake and need to be rectified, and if only they had the numbers, they would exterminate every last human on the planet. So, yeah, there's that. On the other hand, you have people like the Glasswalkers who are like, actually, humans are great, and technology is great, and we can fight the worm with technology. So you get a lot of different views, depending on what kind of werewolf you're dealing with, and what kind of part of the world they're in. The main defining characteristic of werewolves, by the way, is their rage. Werewolves are very angry, and they get angry very easily, and they turn this rage into power. In fact, one of the things that defines a werewolf is what happens when they all get very angry and start raging about the same thing. Werewolves can be very indignant about all manner of things, and there's a reason why they're often characterized as being violent, bloodthirsty monsters. One of the things that characterizes most werewolf games is, how does your character deal with the fact that they have this anger inside of them? And how do they deal with the rage that kind of pushes them forward? Because the rage is not necessarily theirs, because they feel the rage of the earth. So when they see things like despoiling of the land, they become irrationally angry, and the temptation is there to lash out and kill people, which you might not be okay with if you're not the sort of person who grew up among werewolves. In fact, a lot of the time, werewolves do not tell their kids that they might be a werewolf because they never know if their kid's going to be a werewolf. It's not certain. And this is actually one of the things that I think is least good about Werewolf, just from a storytelling perspective. So werewolves are very few in number for the most part. When they have kids, they never know if the kid is going to grow up to be a werewolf or not. And this is the first change happens somewhere between their teenage years and their early 20s. Now, the problem with this dichotomy is that what you end up with is that all werewolves, at least male ones, are then expected to go out and have lots and lots of sex that is unprotected in order to ensure the continuation of their species. Because every kid they have, there's no idea whether or not they're going to be a werewolf one day. So it's the obligation of male werewolves to go out there and sow their seeds, because otherwise there won't be any werewolves left. And personally, I think that's a pretty bad dichotomy of the way of doing things. It's also a bit sexist, because obviously males can impregnate a lot more females than women can get impregnated, simply because once they become pregnant, twice at the same time. Once you're pregnant, you have 9 months before you can get pregnant again. So there's a limit, is what I'm saying. And I don't know, that's one of those things about werewolf that's kind of uncomfortable. And this is a little when you're dealing with the wolf-only clans of werewolves, like the Red Talons, because it essentially means that the werewolves that are there essentially have to breed with every other female, because otherwise, they're literally going to go extinct. And because they can't really turn into humans, or in some cases, actively resent the idea of turning into humans, they have to, continue, their species. And there's a weird undercurrent of, oh no, we're all going to die. We're all going to go extinct. And what should we do about that in Werewolf? Which is why I think Werewolf can be a little uncomfortable to play in some cases, simply because of, the things that go under the surface and the themes that it plays with. Anyway, as said, the thing that defines werewolves is that they're opposed to the worm. Well, who are the agents of the worm? Anything evil, so things like vampires, various mages, humans that particularly like capitalism or polluting things, the Fomori, who are demons basically, or mutated monstrosities. In general, most things. Werewolves are motivated primarily by how much they hate literally everything, and are very easy to get riled up about things. Werewolves overwhelmingly hate cities. They hate the fact that cities exist. They've always hated that cities exist, and as I said before, depending on who you talk to, what kind of werewolf you're talking to, cities are either a thing that should be completely destroyed down to the last brick, or possibly useful against the worm. Okay, so remember earlier when I said that there's a genocide problem with the lore of werewolves? Here's where we get into it. So the very first conflict that the werewolves found was, there's a lot of changing breeds, and I mentioned this in my video about the overworld of the World of Darkness, and all the various different things, and where you should start and where you shouldn't start. And one thing I mentioned was, don't play like the Naga, don't play like the were spiders, don't play a were shark to start out with, because it's just going to be really confusing and you're going to have a bad time. The werewolves, at the beginning of time, basically, were we're Gaia's chosen. We are the protectors of the earth, and everyone else is not. And there were a number of objections to this, most notably the werebears, because there were werebears, and the werewolves responded to this challenge by exterminating them to the last man. Some of them in modern nights feel some regret that they did that, but by and large, most of them still buy into the fact that, well, we're Gaia's chosen, and that means we're allowed and justified in murdering basically anyone who threatens Gaia. This has been a problem numerous times, and this is where we get into the bunyip. So, why? So the first thought might be, what happens when you take a bunch of Europeans, or in this case, a bunch of European werewolves, who are all hopped up on the notion that they are Gaia's chosen, and are justified in using lethal force against anything that they think might be a threat to Gaia. Now you take those people and you ship them to Australia to encounter werewolves who live in Australia with their own views and different, ways of doing things. And the Western werewolves just straight up exterminated them, the bunyip. And depending on who you talk to, this is either a great tragedy and a mark of how far werewolves have fallen, and how easily they are swayed by their darker natures, by the rage inside of them, or a perfectly acceptable thing to do because they're the chosen of Gaia and are always right. Pick a side. In general, what happened was Western werewolves ended up in Australia, discovered the bunyip, and decided that the bunyip were corrupted because they weren't like them, and enacted a policy of genocide. This would be strange if not for the fact that most of the various clans of werewolf have enacted the same policy against each other at various times. For example, the Wendigos and the Red Talons, who exist mostly in North America, are not particularly fond of or friendly with the various European werewolves who showed up in the 1700s and decided to essentially exterminate them. They failed, but, this sort of thing underpins everything in Werewolf because of all the rage. And this is why I had to give a trigger warning in the beginning, because, if you're a werewolf and you've just changed, you're now being thrust into a society that views violence as a positive thing to be wielded out at will, essentially, because you have divine sanction by Gaia and the various spirits to use it. And here are warnings for prospective players and storytellers, because it can be very easy to get carried away when you or to make characters that are, how should I put this, hard to be around. Like, you can be very simple and make a storyline. It's like, okay, well, the evil polluting capitalists, and we are good werewolves who are lashing out and trying to destroy the system that is causing all these problems, and everybody we kill is evil because they're all working for Evil Corp. They're all working for Pentex, and they're all like clearly destroying the planet. Like, they're burning down forests and laughing maniacally on piles of money. Like, you can run a storyline like that and kind of wash over all of the implications of the belief system that underpin Werewolf. Or you can run games where it's like, I don't know, I'm torn between my inner rage that I feel everywhere I go because the spirits are all angry that human society exists and is polluting human society. And I was human, or at least I thought I was, and my parents were human, but I am filled with rage, and I need some way to deal with it, and I keep waking up covered in blood, and how do I deal with this? And this is without even getting into, Werewolf Society, because Werewolf Society is structured in such a way that, by and large, it's very tribalistic, and there's another red flag, because most people, as I said in Mage, or I should say, as I said in my Mage guide, tribalism or tribalistic societies or representations can get into racism very easily, because it can be very stereotypical. So you want to avoid that, but werewolf societies tend to be very tribalistic and fall on lots of tropes that you would see in depictions of like Native American tribes and things like that. And I think I'm probably doing a terrible job of sound like a game you should play. Now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like sitting here and going, man, everything about Werewolf is like a landmine that you don't want to step on. Because, yeah, they do cover the fact that there's a group of werewolves that call themselves the Get of Fenrir. And they are Norse werewolves. Yes, they hate, humans for the most part. And yes, some of them join the Nazis. And it's like, oh. And then they have to like add in there where they're like, yeah, and the ones that did have been hunted down almost to a man. And should be, if any of them are still alive. Because they're basically considered like anathema to the rest of the clan who detest them. And it's like, you could have just not written that into your lore, my guys. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm getting away from the main points, which is that you can run a lot of different stories with Werewolf. You just have to be aware of like the landmines so you don't step on them. Okay? Like, you can run the story, like a simple story of, okay, we're environmentalists, or even not really environmentalists. You're just like, looking out for other people or the environment. Like, I've run in a game of Werewolf that was like, we're going to save the community center. And it was like a 1980s style, like after school special kind of game where it's like these werewolves are trying to save like the community center from Evil Corp. And so we're like trying to like not be like super angry and trying to keep our werewolf side in and like hide the fact that we're werewolves and filled with rage. And so it was kind of entertaining to kind of balance, the feeling of the setting with the nature that you are like a ball of rage that could explode at any moment. You are a hand grenade of teeth and claws, and you could easily rip apart anything that stands in your way, essentially. If you really wanted to, you could just tear open like steel doors, and there's just nothing that can stand between you and killing that evil guy that's over there, if you really want it. You can also run a really awesome game where it's like, we're gonna fight like the super soldiers of Pentex and Evil Corp. We're gonna fight evil mutant monsters, and you kind of have like, some kind of almost B movie or 1970s horror movie vibe, where you're like, okay, we're werewolves and we're gonna fight the Fomori, and the Fomori are like weird creatures with like who ooze radioactive pus and stuff. It's like you can do anything, you can just run with it. There's a lot of fun you can have, but I think all of the fun of Werewolf comes from treating it like a B movie and not taking it so seriously, because if you try to take Werewolf seriously, you get bogged into the weird, like genocidal, race relations that underpin a lot of the lore of Werewolf. Because so much of Werewolf is based around like clan hierarchy and blood hierarchy and racial superiority to humans, and what is our role in caretaking the earth, and how seriously do we have to follow the rules, and what do we do when we find people who don't follow the rules? How should we execute the law, as it were, when they would view us as basically just psychopaths? Like, by and large, most of Werewolf, if you're not a werewolf, is like, why on earth do these beings think of themselves as the arbiters of what is morally good? Because if you're not a werewolf, werewolves are basically just like psychotic extremists who view their role as guardians of the earth as a blank check to commit any number of atrocities against anyone they don't like. It would be like if Captain Planet was made by ISIS. Like, that's kind of the vibe of a lot of werewolf lore, and that's only kept in check by the fact that werewolves die young. Like, werewolves only have an age expectancy of like 30 something. So like, once you become a werewolf, congratulations, your biological clock is now ticking. You have 15 years of life. You better do some good for the world and sow some seeds, otherwise your entire species is going to go bust. Because apparently Gaia doesn't care enough to actually like ensure that her guardians actually can protect the world from the worm. Like, there's so many things in Werewolf that are kind of a mess. And I know that, again, I'm making this sound terrible, but I'm trying to like preempt all of the problems that players and readers encounter when they start reading Werewolf, because obviously almost all of the werewolf clans don't view what they do in these terms. Like, they don't view themselves as extremists. They don't view themselves as being like horrific people by and large. So I'll give you a good example of this. The Shadow Lords are Eastern European werewolves. They are overwhelmingly nobility. They spend a lot of their time acting as nobles and trying to act the part of like lawgivers, and they try to like steer society as best they can. You know, they're like, okay, we can rule over humanity and kind of guide it towards being better. Okay, you have groups like the Glasswalkers, who are like all in on technology. So they're like super into the Weaver. They're super into like using technology to make the world better, to steer humanity away from the worm and kind of contain the worm. So like a Glasswalker would be like, we have these new like power generation sources that produce less waste. So like a Glasswalker would be like, we're gonna invest in nuclear power, but we want to invest in it and kind of push it forward so that it produces less waste and therefore hurts the environment less than, say, coal does. You know, you have groups like the Silent Striders, who are like, we want to gather information and wander around and kind of try to forge a kind of unified identity among people. We want to preempt like conflict and war, because we think if we get everybody in a room together and we show them that you're not all that different, that we can avoid horrible tragedies. Okay? You have groups like the Bone Gnawers, who are essentially, I don't want to call them like lower classes, but the Bone Gnawers are essentially like, they're like homeless werewolves, basically. They exist within the lower like castes of various societies. They kind of move around in the underworld, and they kind of like deal with all of the evil things that spawn out of the various slums and areas that every city has. I should point out that Werewolf is very spiritual, as probably have noticed, but I mean that like the spirit world, the ether, exists as a physical place, and there are spirits, and everything has a spirit. Okay? Every alarm clock, every tree, every blade of grass has a spirit, and the spirits can want things, and if they're mad or if they're worm corrupted, bad things happen in the real world. And so lots of Werewolf is finding spirits, finding what they want, and trying to make things better. Because essentially what happens is that the Weaver wants everything to be the same forever. The wild is kind of crazy and everything's kind of fluid. And the worm is everything is corrupted and evil, and places that are infested with like worm-touched spirits are like more depressing. They feel wrong. Essentially, like if you walked into a room and the spirits of the room were corrupted by the worm, it would like eat at you. You would feel fatigued. You would feel on edge. It would be like something is wrong. Like something is very wrong and something has gone wrong. And this can infest like entire places. So this is another reason why a lot of werewolves don't view what they're doing as being like evil, because when they look at something like, oh, the humans are building a mine and they're despoiling the land, and now there's a bunch of worm spirits in the mine or coming out of the mine that were deep within the earth, and they're infecting everything around it. We need to stop it. But if you don't know this, if you're on the outside, if you're just a dude who works in the mine, what you're dealing with is a bunch of like 8-foot tall werewolves have just stormed into your place of work and started killing everybody, screaming about how the whole place is infected with evil spirits. Like, that's the other side of this coin that you need to pay attention to. And depending on what clan you're a part of, depending on what tribe your werewolves as players or as storyteller belong to, will depend on how much you take the direct approach. Okay? Like, the Silver Fangs, by and large, like the Shadow Lords, by and large, are much more likely to take a backseat and try to, like, work through diplomacy and maybe try to, like, work through the government, which may or may not be attractive to your players. Like, depending on what kind of players you have, a bunch of werewolves in a boardroom running over community presentations may or may not be interesting. Compare this to the Red Talons, whose first and last choice whenever dealing with anything is kill it, and if that doesn't work, kill it more. That can be fun, but it can also be kind of repetitive and a little boring if that's how you solve every problem. So, now that I've said, you can probably go, this seems like it's really hard to play. Like, it seems like there's only like a couple sort of like stories that you can really write. What do you do here? How can you, like, give yourself more freedom? And the way that I would put this is, the two best ways to give yourself freedom, and the two best ways to kind of, like, how do I put this? I don't know. Enlarge your horizons is probably the way to put it, is to set things in the past, but not too far in the past, and to sort of double down on spirit stuff. And I'll explain both. So, there's a lot of books about the Dark Ages werewolf. And the thing about Dark Ages werewolf is there's a caste system. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention this about werewolf. Werewolf has a caste system in each tribe, and depending on what phase of the moon you turned, depends on your status as a werewolf. So, I really hope you like playing around with caste systems, because that's part of werewolf. But anyway, so there's a caste system among the tribes, where tribes like the Shadow Lords and the Silver Fangs are always above people like the Bone Gnawers. Like, just being a Bone Gnawer makes you a lower class compared to, like, the Shadow Lords or the Silver Fangs. So you have to play around with that. So I probably wouldn't recommend playing Middle Ages werewolf. What I would recommend is you either play, like, werewolves in, say, like, the Wild West era. And I know I mentioned that for Mage too, but it's also a great setting for werewolf. Or, and here's the thing which I've only done once, but which was a lot of fun, go back to, like, early humanity. Like, go back to, like, Sumer and, like, Babylon and, like, ancient Egypt werewolves. Okay? Where, like, humanity is just starting out. And so, like, your job is to fight, like, evil spirits and things that exist in ancient times before, like, humanity explodes, essentially. And so you can kind of get this sort of, like, epic feeling. Like, you're fighting titanic monsters of yesteryear that don't exist in the modern age. And things like that, you know. And that's a lot of fun. I would recommend that for other people, because when I did that, I think it's the most fun I've ever had playing werewolf. The second thing that I said, I want to make it about spirits and double down on that. What do I mean by that? essentially what you can do is turn your werewolf game into Ghost Hunters. And this can be a lot of fun. Because what you do is, rather than focus on, like, dealing with, like, real-world stuff and politics and all of that, what you have is, like, you go to places that are haunted and you deal with the problems. Okay? Like, you have your guys track down things, and you start delving into the deep ether, and you go into places where, like, everything has a face, and everything has a spirit, and you end up with, like, or, like, solving murder mysteries, or things like that, using the spirit world. So, like, imagine your werewolves are, like, trying to solve a murder, and the way in which you solve the murder is you go into, the ether, you go into the astral plane, and you talk to the spirit of a bed who had the murder in it. And you go, what happened? And now you have to find a way to prove that what the bed is saying is correct. Okay, you can do things like that with Werewolf, and that's a lot of fun. Because you can pretty much play off anything when you start doing it this way. You can play detective, you can have it be a story about, like, finding things out, or, and this is the best part, the spirits have their own agendas, okay? The various spirits have their own interests and have their own desires when you start getting into more powerful spirits. Like, if your werewolves are like, okay, the spirit of the land is really angry because the humans have started cutting down the trees. And so the spirit is super angry and wants you to stop them. Okay, and so you're like, all right, we're going to stop them, and we're going to convince them to stop cutting down trees. And then you do, and then the spirit is like, no, I wanted you to kill them all. No, I'm not happy with you. I want you to keep doing it. And so now the spirit is actually your enemy. Now you've flipped it around where, like, the earth itself is rebelling against you because it is either A, worm corrupted, or B, has been insulted to the point where now you're like, how do I placate the spirit of the forest, which cannot be placated against human life? Like, how do we stop the forest from being angry and turning into the forest from, like, Lord of the Rings that, like, kills people? Like, how do we do this? You know, that's how you can, like, kind of craft your story. And in general, I would probably avoid setting, like, I'd probably play down the whole tribalism, caste system, like, blood feud stuff. Like, that would be me. Mostly because I can't imagine that being any way to run a game. I know some people really enjoy that aspect. They enjoy the kind of, like, nothing is entirely black and white in a setting that is overwhelmingly black and white, because there is good and there is evil in Werewolf. The worm is just straight up evil. And the whole point of werewolves is literally to fight that evil. But when you start getting into, like, the systems that underpin a lot of the werewolf tribes, it's kind of uncomfortable, and probably isn't very comfortable for a number of players. I've met a lot of people who, even if they're kind of interested in werewolf, are not at all interested in a lot of the themes that underpin a lot of the stories that are told in Werewolf. Even more so than the ones in Mage or Vampire. I think if you avoid those, you can mostly play around them. I think, unlike, say, Mage, Werewolf gives you the freedom to play around with this stuff. So you can play a werewolf game without having to get into the whole genocide thing, without having to get into the fact that there are entire tribes of werewolves that actively believe that the only way to, like, save the earth is to kill every living human being. Okay? Like, by and large, you know, you can run games that don't deal with these problems. Okay? You can run games that are lighthearted in Werewolf. You can run games that are all combat-oriented. You can run games that are all diplomacy-oriented. Werewolf is very fluid in that regard, in the same way Vampire is. So like, if you're interested at all in, like, okay, I want to run Werewolf, and I want to run, like, X kind of game, you can probably do that without too much of an issue. But I have to keep harping on all the bad stuff because it's a big part of the lore. There's a lot of it, and there's a lot of focus on it, and depending on what kind of tone you're going for, it may or may not be a big issue. I think that's it, really. I mean, I think that's really it. I know this one's shorter than the other videos, but the problem is that, like, Werewolf is the one that I've played the least out of all of them. Mostly because a whole lot of people don't really enjoy playing Werewolf the Apocalypse compared to playing Mage or Vampire. Vampire's a lot easier to run, and it's a lot easier to run without having to worry about all these moral implications because vampires are all monsters by default. Mage is harder to run than Werewolf, but Mage is more esoteric and not so set in stone. The way Werewolf is set up from a moral perspective that can be kind of hard to play around. But I think you can if you really want to. I think if you make a lot of things a personal story or set things up to where you're not having to confront, like, what a lot of the doctrines of various werewolves believe, you'll be fine. But yeah, I'm sorry if I've made this sound horrific. I'm sorry if I've been, like, made this sound like, why would anyone play this? Because I really don't mean to, but I also can't in good conscience not bring it up. Because it's a really important part of the lore, and if I didn't mention it and you sat down and read the whole sections about what various tribes' view of their histories, you would probably be horrified. So, yeah, that's Werewolf for you. The best I can say is good luck if you're going to run Werewolf. It can be interesting, but it can be really hard, I think, to get beyond the various, like, morality issues that Werewolf brings up. So yeah, that's it. See y'all later.